Hello, and welcome to Cosmological Arguments. I'm your host, John Bannon. Debunking Atheism, Volume 14. In this video, I want to go over quickly a simple atheistic argument, but it's a serious enough argument that I want to address it. The atheistic argument goes like this. Let's say God is omniscient and omnipotent. That means God knows everything and has all powers. All right, well, let's say there's a human being, and this human being has a choice between actions A or actions B. So the human being can choose to do either A or B. Well, the atheistic argument goes that, well, if God is omniscient, all-knowing, then God would already know what it is you're going to choose. So let's say you're going to ultimately choose B. So God would know that you were going to choose B before you made your choice. So if God is omniscient, then God must know what you're going to do before you do it. So God would have to know that your choice would be B. But this creates a problem, because if you can't choose to do A, then you have no free will. You're bound to choose B. And if God doesn't know that you're going to choose B, thus preserving your free will, then God can't be omniscient. So it's a paradox. It's a paradox. How can you have free will and yet God also be omniscient and omnipotent? So what's the solution to this paradox? Well, you have to understand that God is uncaused. And because of that, God's mind and his decision-making ability is also uncaused because it's part of his mind. Now, the nature of an uncaused thing is that it has no causal explanation to give. It's uncaused. An uncaused thing is not made of parts, or it would be caused by those parts. So there's no causal chain to determine an outcome in an uncaused decision-making process. So because God's decision-making process is uncaused, there is no causal chain. There's no causal explanation for the decision. It's a mysterious, uncaused decision-making ability. But God is also outside of time. God creates time. God can't be subject to that which he creates. That would be self-creation, which is illogical. So God's decision-making is not only without a causal chain or a causal explanation, it's also outside of time. It's non-temporal. Temporal meaning having to do with time. So it's non-temporal, uncaused decision-making. Now, this is an extraordinarily mysterious and utterly incomprehensible decision-making capacity that God has. But it's a direct consequence of the fact that God is uncaused and is not subject to time. So, despite that, God is nonetheless able to decide on what to make real and what not to make real in physical reality. So this is an utterly incomprehensible, unique decision-making capacity that God has. It's not like a human being's decision-making, which is done in time. So with God, there's no such thing as pre-knowledge. God does not know what you're going to do before you do it. That's sort of pre-knowledge. Because in order to have pre-knowledge that something will happen, you yourself would have to be subject to time. You would have to know something in time before it happens at a later time. God is not subject to time. So God doesn't have pre-knowledge. God has knowledge of what you are going to do, but it's not a temporal knowledge. It's not a knowledge that runs in time. It's a unique, mysterious, incomprehensible decision-making power that God has. All right, so God. The question is, well, if God knows you're going to do B, does that mean it's determined that you're going to do B and that you couldn't choose A? Because if you couldn't choose A, then you don't have free will. You must do B. And the answer is no, because God is the one who wills everything in the universe. And God's decision making is not deterministic. It's not based on a causal chain. You cannot give a causal explanation for God's decision making. It's incomprehensible and uncaused and not subject to time. So, when God decides that you're going to do B, because nothing occurs in the universe without God doing it. So when God says you're going to do B, it's not determined. God does not determine that you're going to do B. God doesn't use determinism to make a decision that you're fated to do B. So the truth is, God's decision that B will occur does not deprive you of free will, because God's decision making is not deterministic. It's not based on a causal chain of determinism that would bind you to this, making this not an option. Now, what this means is that although God knows that you're going to do B, this does not deprive you of the free will to perform A. But what God knows is that even though you do have the choice to perform A, God knows you won't. God knows you're going to do B. Even though you have a choice, nonetheless, to do A, because God's decision making is not deterministic in nature. And that's the key. The key is understanding God's uncaused, non-temporal decision-making capacity. It is not deterministic. It is not based on a causal chain. There is no way to causally explain God's decision-making because God's not made of parts. There's no chain of causation, no determinism to his decision-making, and it's not done in time. So that's the answer. You do, in fact, have free will, and it's not determined that you are set to do B. God simply knows that that's what you're going to choose, even though you still have the choice to pick A. All right, so a short way of saying this is you're still free to choose either option, but God knows which option you will choose without fating you to that determination, because God's decision making is not deterministic. All right. Hope you enjoyed that and you learned something. There is no paradox. God can be omnipresent, omniscient, and omnipotent, and human beings could still have what's essentially a virtual form of free will through God's non-deterministic, uncaused, non-temporal, mysterious, incomprehensible decision-making ability. All right. Take care.